She stood alone on the church steps, veil tangled in the wind, her wedding dress torn and dirt-streaked, abandoned an hour before the vows. The crowd whispered, then vanished, leaving her to walk barefoot into the dust. A wagon creaked into view, driven by a stranger with no questions. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The dust clung to her skin like shame, fine as flour and just as unforgiving. Each step Samantha took ground gravel into her bare feet, but she welcomed the pain. It was honest. Unlike the whispered apologies that tried to follow her out of the chapel, or the pitying glances masked as concern. They had watched her be abandoned, every one of them, and none had stopped him. Not the pastor, not the tailor who fitted her dress, not even the old widow who'd once called her the kind that held a home together. A red ribbon trailed from the bouquet still clenched in her hand, frayed and damp from her grip. It was supposed to be her grandmother's, passed down 3 generations. Now it fluttered behind her like a flag of defeat, dragging the weight of a name she no longer wanted to carry. Bell. She had practiced writing it just last night on a scrap of paper. Samantha Bell. Curled letters, like a girl in love. Now that name burned in her mouth like ashes. The torn hem of her gown caught briars by the roadside. She didn't stop to pull them free. Each snag was a memory, each tear a word Jacob had never had the courage to say to her face. Too rough around the edges, too loud when she laughed, too stubborn to be soft. He'd wanted a doll, something he could place on his mother's mantle. Samantha had come with calluses and opinions, and that had frightened them both. She passed the old well where children left coins and wishes. Her shadow broke across the stone like a question mark. What now? Where do the unchosen go when the music stops and the doors close? The sky stretched wide, too beautiful for the ache in her chest. Blue that mocked her with its openness, as if to say the world had always been bigger than that church, that boy, that dream. But Samantha had believed. She'd sewn lace onto her sleeves by hand. She'd scrubbed that chapel's floorboards herself. She'd bought perfume with the last of her tips and worn it in secret, because she wanted to feel like more than someone's last resort. A hawk circled overhead, and still she walked. By the time the wagon wheel groaned around the bend behind her, she no longer recognized the girl in white. Only the woman in mud and torn satin still moving forward, because standing still meant remembering, and she wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The wagon creaked beneath them, its old axles groaning with each rise and dip of the road like they too bore witness to a burden that was not theirs to carry. Samantha sat stiffly, the coarse wool of Eli's coat wrapped around her shoulders, its warmth slow to reach her bones. It smelled faintly of pine smoke and horses, a scent that reminded her of long rides with her father before the bank took their land and grief hollowed him out. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was wide, roomy, like he understood that words could bruise where silence might heal. Eli didn't glance her way, didn't ask questions. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, letting the rhythm of hooves on dirt speak whatever comfort they could offer. A cold wind swept across the flat land, tugging at the remnants of lace on her sleeve. She clutched the coat tighter. The torn dress beneath it had started to itch, not from the fabric, but from what it had come to represent. Humiliation stitched into every seam. She could still feel the eyes of the congregation, their silence louder than any shouted insult. And worst of all, the echo of Jacob's absence. A void that made her feel less than whole, like something discarded, not simply left behind. The wagon passed a rusted fence line where crows perched like sentinels. Samantha caught her reflection in a pane of broken glass hanging by a nail from one of the posts. What she saw there stopped her breath. Not the dirt on her face or the ruined gown, but the eyes. They looked older, not wiser, just tired, stripped. Beside her, Eli shifted slightly, as if sensing the heaviness she carried. He didn't look at her, but he cleared his throat. "Don't matter what a dress looks like after the dance ends. What matters is who's still standing." It wasn't meant as poetry, and it wasn't offered for her to answer. She didn't. But her hand relaxed slightly where it had clutched the coat closed, and for the first time since the church bells failed to ring, she felt the smallest crack form in the wall she'd bricked up around her heart. At the fork in the road, where one path led back toward town and the other east to the orchards, Eli pulled the reins. The horse obeyed with a low snort, as if he too had grown used to choosing quiet over comfort. "I got a spare cabin near the orchard," Eli said again, like it didn't need explaining. "It's dry, got a stove, no strings." Samantha looked at him fully now. His face was lean, carved by sun and time, not cruelty. His eyes were steady, not soft, not hard, just there, like he'd seen bad years and come out the other side with something gentler, not smaller. She thought of going back, to the whispers, the pews, the narrow streets that remembered too well. Then she looked ahead, where the orchard trees blurred in the golden light. She nodded once, not because she trusted him, but because, for the first time all day, she could breathe. The cabin was small, its walls whispering with age, but it held the kind of silence that didn't sting. It wrapped around Samantha like a worn shawl, threadbare in places but warm where it counted. There was a rhythm to her days now, not the urgent pacing of a woman waiting to be chosen, but the measured tempo of someone learning how to stay. Morning began with the stove crackling to life, the scent of wood smoke seeping into her cotton dress as she kneaded dough in the bowl Eli had left by the door. Plain, handmade, with the tiniest chip on one lip. She found herself talking to it sometimes, as if the vessel could answer back. "You've seen better days," she'd murmur. "But then again, so have I." She scrubbed the windows until they let in light that didn't make her flinch. She hemmed curtains so the wind wouldn't bite her ankles. And each night, she stitched. The quilt grew slowly, not from need but from memory. A square of faded pink from an apron that had belonged to her mother. A triangle of calico from a market dress she could no longer wear. The torn lace from her wedding dress, now softened by touch, no longer looked tragic. It looked repurposed, reclaimed. Eli never asked what she was making. He just brought her small things. Bundles of dried lavender, a tin of buttons, once even a spool of red thread that matched nothing she had. "Thought it looked cheerful," he shrugged. He rarely spoke without cause, but his presence was constant. She heard him in the thud of his boots on the porch and the steady rhythm of his axe as he split firewood. He never lingered, never pressed, but always knocked, even when the door was already ajar. That, more than words, told her he saw her, not as a guest or a burden, but as a person whose space deserved respect. On rainy afternoons, he'd bring her books wrapped in oilcloth, old volumes with yellowed pages, smelling of dust and dry hay. Once, she found a pressed violet between the pages of a poetry book. She didn't ask if he'd put it there. One evening, while the sky melted into gold, they sat on the porch without speaking. Samantha worked the needle through a patch of deep indigo, Eli's shirt, worn thin at the elbows. Her fingers moved steadily, anchoring the stitch with quiet precision. Eli broke the silence. "You remind me what grace looks like," he said, not as a compliment but as a fact he'd only just realized. Samantha's throat tightened, but she didn't speak. She just kept stitching, her hand steady, her chest full. The needle pulled through the fabric one last time, and she tied it off with a knot that felt like a promise. The piece in her lap bore a single phrase, sewn with careful care into a patch of curtain linen still worthy. The evening air hung with the scent of pine resin and fresh bread, and the lanterns strung between trees cast soft halos across the clearing. It was the kind of night that didn't rush, the kind that let silence linger and allowed even broken hearts a moment to catch their breath. Samantha stood near the edge of the gathering, her hands folded loosely in front of her. The quilt draped around her shoulders was heavy with memory, its seams stitched with quiet defiance. Each patch bore witness to the day she was left, to the mornings she rose anyway, to the slow, honest hours she built herself back up with needle and thread. Her dress, though simple, bore the marks of care, tiny embroidered flowers at the hem, faint traces of lavender in the folds from when she'd pressed it between sachets. It was not a dress meant to impress. It was meant to belong to her. The townsfolk noticed. Of course they did. Cold Creek never forgot a scandal. There were nods masked as curiosity, half smiles hiding judgment. A woman rejected at the altar was supposed to disappear, not reappear stronger, quieter, and dressed in her own story. She heard them. She came back? That's the one Jacob left. Poor thing. And then, boots on dry pine needles. Eli Walker, coat brushed, hair combed in a way that spoke of effort rather than vanity. He offered no flourish, no apology for the interruption, just his hand, palm open, steady. Dance? Samantha didn't answer with words. She placed her hand in his. The music was slow, a fiddle and a dulcimer, notes spilling like creek water over stones. Under the pines they moved in a rhythm all their own. Not rehearsed, not performative. Just two people who understood what it meant to lose something and choose to keep going anyway. Her cheek brushed his chest, and for the first time in a long time, she did not brace for disappointment. She simply was, and that was enough. The song tapered off, leaving only the echo of movement and breath. Eli stepped back, turned to the crowd. She was never the one who wasn't enough, he said, voice steady but unflinching. She was too much for a small man. The stillness that followed was thick with reckoning. No laughter, no rebuttal, just the sound of shame shifting in the throats of those who had watched her fall and said nothing. Then, one clap, then another. Samantha didn't bow her head. She let the praise fall where it would. She had nothing to prove. Her worth had never depended on their permission.